Can everyone hear us well? Should we do a mic check? Check, check.
Should I freestyle for my mic check?
Yes. What do you usually do?
It's going to be crazy.
I usually just plagiarize other people's lines, but so far it's working.
Okay, all right. Maybe we can do it at the end. Maybe that could be a fun thing. Thank you so much for all showing up in such a big number. Man, packed house. Good job. What are we, 6 days before the midterm? I should know this, 5 days. 5 days. And we are all getting lots of sleep, aren't we? Yeah? Not tired at all?
You guys look well rested,
Yeah.
as does
How are
the
you guys
front of the
doing?
audience. I
Okay.
can't see the very back.
Nervous? A little bit. So let's start off by talking about the very real allegations of the very real sexual harassment.
You want to start with sex?
Again, yes, let's start with sex to keep it interesting, to keep everyone awake. Against Robert Mueller, right? So, what is, for those of you who weren't around, or looking at your phones or on Twitter for the last 2 or 3 hours, there was a news conference with no, witnesses, no evidence. What do we know?
They made it up.
Yeah.
So basically, it appears to be an organized effort to have paid women to come forward and make allegations against Robert Mueller with a two-prong agenda. One, to really sneer at the Me Too movement, and particularly coming off the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, to suggest that somehow, women were just making up lies about men, and it was gonna be a funny thing to have the same thing happen to Mueller, and the other was apparently to discredit Robert Mueller and his investigation. So fortunately, it became pretty clear that it was just a whole lot of made-up stuff, and now the investigation is turned the other way.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think trying to frame Bob Mueller as like trying to pick a fight with the bouncer at the nightclub, like the last person you want to do.
Okay.
But I would echo what Maya said and also add that it fits into a larger issue that's hanging over, obviously, the midterms and the Trump era, which is whether our justice system is going to be allowed to work or is going to be subverted in such a way that we actually kneecap the independent investigation of what happened. And that's really important. And I imagine many of you, if you're here tonight, you're informed, you're following this stuff, you've probably heard about this tradition that the DOJ doesn't even like to comment close to an election, let alone issue indictments or other things. It's not a law, because obviously you can imagine all types of emergency situations where the equities might demand that you do comment or you do indict. It says a lot. That statement that Bob Mueller's office put out was obviously personally approved by him a week out from an election, which tells you that even though this was a bizarre, weird, fake sex honeypot conspiracy theory plot or whatever, it was serious enough that they didn't think it could wait 6 days. They felt the need to, quote, get ahead of it in media terms or to put a marker down in legal terms and say, we see you, the FBI's investigating this, and that's it.
Right.
I just have to say, though, what's been astounding about the past several weeks for black people is that white people are constantly wrongly accused of crime. So I just want to say, we feel deeply, deeply pained by all the accusations against you.
Because you touched on the legal system and what could happen to that. I want to start with the worst case scenario. For I think many, not maybe all of you in the room, but like, what if the Republicans keep all three branches of government, right? What if I know. That's why I want to start with it. It's like starting with the broccoli and then we'll get to the dessert. Is the Mueller investigation, is there any sort of, do you have hope that it will go anywhere if the Republicans keep charge of everything?
Well, since we're here on a midterms night and I can see if I do this, by a show of hands, how many people think the Democrats will take back the House?
Okay.
And how many people, by a show of hands, do not?
You still remember November 2016?
Yeah, I mean, right?
And I think if you did that a week out of the last election, you'd have as many hands up, and we have the outcomes that we get. So I think it's very unpredictable, although unlike the last election, these are a lot of local races, which means the statistical shifts to surprise you would have to be even greater, but anything can happen, and 5 days is a long time in politics.
Right.
I spoke to a former U.S. attorney, Republican, who worked with the Trump campaign pretty closely, so that already narrows the sourcing quite a bit. But recently who said, look, he's gonna fire Jeff Sessions after the midterms either way, but it will feel differently with the reaction either way. And I think if the Democrats take back the House, the tricky thing will be for those who care about doing this independently and not just finding any excuse to escalate a fight with the president is how do you responsibly back up an independent investigation and deal with the things that he does, but not overreact and not everything can be the Saturday Night Massacre. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, if you remove Jeff Sessions, the whole recusal thing goes away, Rod Rosenstein goes away, and you have a new person who's Mueller's boss. And then the question is, does that become a way to interfere with the investigation or not?
What's your take on Mueller or other things that could go badly? Again, we're going to get to the good stuff later, but let's start with.
I definitely agree with Ari,
Yeah.
and I would say that if we're in a worst case scenario, which I'm hopeful we won't be in, but if we're in a worst case scenario, there's no question that there will be interference with the Mueller investigation, but Robert Mueller is not a fool. And Robert Mueller knows this may be one of his scenarios, and as we were talking about on the beat last night, the possibility of additional indictments that may come after the election will create an opportunity to get more evidence into the public eye. And with sufficient evidence, we don't know what the evidence will be, right? But say Donald Trump Jr. is indicted, right? All right, so now we're feeling better. And we don't know. That was, I'm just saying what if. But if that were to happen, and I think what we don't know is, does Robert Mueller have some indictments that are going to be coming forward that will allow a public display of evidence, and what will that evidence show? Because politically, if it gets bad enough, and again, we don't know, that's another big if, it could create a different kind of political pressure that creates some support for Robert, not just his investigation, but for a public outcry about what the implications are for our country. So that's the best case scenario if we're in the worst case scenario.
I like that approach. Yeah, great
That's
attitude.
Thank you. See,
So let's talk about the best case scenario for many people who are in the room. So what if Democrats, obviously the House is probably the biggest, the most favorable and possible outcome right now, it flipping to the Democrats. How can that be a pivotal change? How can Democrats give Republicans hell if they win the House? And explain all of the ways. Just go deep into it.
Well,
don't hold back.
I think when you look at the dynamics in the midterms, you have one of these situations where a lot of what we talk about and a lot of what we can see day to day is totally removed from what's actually happening out in the midterms. So I think it's fair to say there's a lot of reaction to Donald Trump's controversies, the style of governing or lack thereof, and a lot of other political hypocrisy and drama. When you go out and look at the fundamentals in these races, the two issues voters say concern them the most across the board: healthcare and special interests having too much power in Washington. On healthcare, we've seen Republicans running to say they're for parts of Obamacare, when most people know, even if you don't watch the news all the time, they kept holding these votes to repeal Obamacare. When you say, oh, well, everyone's always talking about Donald Trump, so that's in everyone's faces. Well, yes, and he's certainly eaten the culture. So if you flip around, you can flip well outside of the news and you still see Trumpism. But out in people's communities and in their districts in these races, they're choosing from a pool, this we already know, no matter what happens Tuesday, they're choosing from a pool of candidates that looks fundamentally different from any we've ever seen before. A record-breaking number of women candidates, the first time that either party, and again, some of these things become very partisan, no, both parties have widely only nominated white men for most posts most of the time. So even when you have an African-American president, the Democratic Party, the majority of the nominees in the House races were still white men. This is the first year, Tuesday, that the majority of Democratic congressional nominees are not white men. That itself is a cultural change, right? 13% of Republican candidates are women, which, while lower, is higher than it's ever been for the Republican Party. So there's all these other things happening below the surface in our politics that I think go to the question that you've posed, which is, what does it look like on Tuesday and who comes in? So I would say two things, and I'm very curious what you think. One is that if the Democrats are taking back the House, they're doing it on the strength of that different type of coalition. In the same way that Alabama elected a Democrat with a higher African-American voter turnout than happened in either of the Obama years in the special election. So there's all sorts of things happening in coalition building that will literally change who's in the Congress. Not to plug the beat, but you're both on the beat, and maybe some of you guys have seen the show. We had someone on last night, a doctor who made the point she's a first-time candidate, and she made the point that there's never been a female doctor elected to the U.S. Congress. You know? And I don't swear on TV, but that's fucking crazy. Because the Congress has been making a lot of rules that affect women and doctors and how the two are allowed to relate. So she's making that point. So I just think even beyond partisanship and Trump, that could be a whole new pool of people running our government. And then the second point is, yes, and maybe you'll speak a little more to this, you've got people like Jerry Nadler who are very focused on, and Adam Schiff, on how they want to do investigations.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, is actually having an investigation, having one. That would be a change for the House. So the tricky thing is, I mean, they're already talking about and considering all the ways in which they try to open and handle that investigation. So both with regard to Donald Trump and the possible conspiracy with Russia in terms of interfering in the election, but also Brett Kavanaugh. Now, remember, that scenario on Brett Kavanaugh in particular also requires the Senate. It's really the Senate, because it's the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it's the Senate that has the constitutional authority for advice and consent. So that's a little more complicated. But in terms of the House, they can absolutely reopen the investigation, and then they can decide to make public what they find. And that's the big game changer. Now, I think that, but they will also have to be mindful, depending on what Robert Mueller is doing, because they do have to be careful about doing things that may make it harder for him to investigate and potentially bring his indictments. And so they'll have to do a dance to make sure they're not unintentionally undermining whatever. But again, they'll probably be assessing that based on the previous conversation we had, right? Which is, whether or not Trump is going to fire Sessions either way. So there is going to be someone in there who's going to have a lot more power to undermine Mueller. So there's going to be a dance going on if they win the House that'll be very complicated.
Right.
And can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What do you think the actual political and cultural impact would be if a lot of the women candidates in both parties win on Tuesday? We ran the numbers. If every woman running won, it wouldn't flip the gender of the House, but it would be the closest to 50% it's ever been.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a country, I'm from Canada, where we have 50% in our parliament, and that was a change that Justin Trudeau did when he went. Did someone whisper something? Did I get it wrong? I'm just hearing things. But yeah, that makes a fundamental difference in the way the government works and in the kinds of policies, right? And the kinds of things that are passed. And speaking about the woman that you were talking about that was on your show yesterday, who's running, you didn't just have one woman on, you had 8 women on.
That's right.
Who are first-time candidates. You had them all at the same time. That's amazing. I don't know how your producers did that. Kudos. That's incredible.
Well, since we go behind the scenes, they were all scheduled last week, and they all had to be coordinated, rescheduled when we had the terrible news of the pipe bombings.
Right.
And they all worked it to come together and to see.
That's what we do. We get it together. Well, and I thought that was amazing. I've been able to, report on and sort of speak to women who are first-time candidates. Luba Gretchen Shirley, who's running in New York, I met with her, and she's a mom, she has 2 kids, she was running her own business, and she decided to run for office. And one of the things that she did was realize that the FEC doesn't let you pay for your babysitter with your own campaign funds, the own money that you're raising money with, that you've raised, right?
What about an NDA for your mistress?
Oh, see, maybe you could do that. That counts. See, but like that, right? That is what happens there. It's not that necessarily people were like, let's make sure that moms who have small children can't run. But when you have moms with small children who are running and who are able to do that and who are in the political environment, that changes. You can change the rules, right? And so she made the really salient point that almost half of people who are in Congress are millionaires. Of course, right? And the women who are able to run are much older, right? It's that once that their kids are already grown up, then they feel like they can go into politics. But if you give them the option to pursue that path when they have young children, then there's a whole new group of people who are now able to represent our government. So it's great. I think it's great. I think it'll be great. So, okay, and what about in terms of policies? Like abolish ICE, Medicare for all, like could these things happen if Democrats take the House? No.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
No.
It's not gonna happen.
No, it's not going to happen. And the reason is because as long as Trump's still in the White House, you still, even if the Dems take back the Senate, they're not going to have a 60-vote majority. So it will have to be veto-proof, and Trump can veto it and send it back. Now, having said that, it's not that it's unimportant, though, to bring the bills forward, go through hearings, through committee, bring it to floor votes, have a parallel process in the Senate, because part of what that does is create a societal discourse about what our problems are and what the solutions need to be. And that does matter even if the legislation doesn't get passed, because often it does take multiple cycles. I mean, think about healthcare reform and the Affordable Care Act. Frankly, in this country, we've been trying to get some form of universal health care since Truman. Since Truman. So I just say that because it does matter that we have more of the conversations with people sharing their stories, being able to do hearings, have experts talk about what will work, and it creates the potential. I mean, back to Ari, your point about culture change, because frankly, the more women we have, the more conversations we're going to have about compromising and getting some elements passed. But it's not going to happen just in one session of Congress because there's a flip, because there's still going to be a highly polarized beltway.
I also think whether or not the House becomes a center for Democratic resistance, which is anti-Trump, and what you just described, which is laying out a vision of governing, will be incredibly pivotal to what 2020 looks like.
Absolutely.
And it's very hard to predict anything on those terms, but does everyone want to hear the 2020 re-election pitch on behalf of Donald Trump?
Yes.
You're interested in reporting and is that a no? A couple no's. Appreciate your honesty. Donald Trump will go into 2020, according to a lot of what we've seen and what we've reported and what we're hearing from people close to this, with a pitch that says, everyone told you I was going to be a total disaster, that I have no idea what I'm doing, the markets were supposed to crash, the government was going to fall apart, there was going to be a nuclear crisis, all these terrible warnings, some of which may still be relevant depending on the chances and the odds of what this president has to face and who he listens to. But he's going to say, you heard all those terrible things, the markets are fine or maybe great. American government has not disintegrated. The things that people said I was doing that were totally unconstitutional, illegal, some of them like the travel ban and what I'm doing in immigration, whether you like it or not, are legal. They have been upheld to some degree. The courts are fine, and for conservatives, I've got 2 people on the conservative Supreme Court. Do I legislate? Yeah, a little bit, and I got a big tax plan through, and it helps everyone, and you could debate the facts of that. Yeah. The wall, it's being built. Not true, but that's what it'll run on. Immigration will continue to be a specter that's a mix of blatant lies like what we've seen this week, and a lot of that we just haven't reported. We don't do a lot of segments on the caravan because it's not a real thing in U.S. domestic policy right now, so we don't even report on it, but there'll be that. And then there'll be this larger mood of like everything you've heard then is really overstatedly negative, so you don't have to believe it, and who do they have, and the merciless, withering attacks on who they have. In a decent economy, if there is one, that's a very strong re-election message. And if the Democrats are controlling the House, there's much more of a position for them to say, yes, but here's all these other things we're doing beyond Trump, and if we get in, those would become law. And without that, I think then you start to look at really, really high odds of a Trump re-election.
Right. We're back to Bummerville.
And then your MAGA outfit will be welcome
great.
for 4 more years.
That wasn't right.
Purpose. Yeah.
And that wasn't right. You need to check him right now, Liz.
There's less options for us as women for pantsuits. That's just what.
Respect.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to say. Well, okay, I do want to talk about the caravan, not because, you brought it up. I want to talk about Trump's last ditch effort to like scare white people into voting because, I don't know, brown and black people are coming to eat you or something, right? So the caravan, and he's sending 15,000 soldiers to the border, which is like 3 times as many people as there are in the actual caravan. So there's gonna be like a buddy system or something, 2 soldiers they'll be watching each other. So this is what I grapple with in the media, and I wanna know what you think, both think. How do we not, and your point here of saying we're not going to report on the caravan because it's not a thing in domestic policy, they're thousands of miles away, right? And this is a thing that he's using to stroke fear. But if we don't, do we report on the racism, right? Do we report on the narrative and on the lies that are being told? Or does that mean that we're playing into it and therefore giving it more attention and we haven't learned our lesson from 2016?
I think we're dealing with someone who's a very deliberate, very effective marketer who understands trolling and is highly cynical. And one of his seemingly sociopathic superpowers is he doesn't have any great sense of shame, so he's not actually worried about anything else.
It's called a sociopath. He's
you know.
a
Sociopath.
That's my diagnosis.
That's your diagnosis.
And I'm sticking with it.
And so, we report on people who are politicians. They obviously have a way they got to where they are and where they're going, but they have other constraints of what their family thinks or what donors think. Often obviously has a big impact, but also whether they're going to feel reviled at their country club or not. Charlottesville was notable not because it was some great point of moral clarity. I don't think it was for the nation in many ways, but how you saw that some people were, this was too much for Gary Cohn, and so he had to, and the reporting shows this, he had to find a way to convey this because he said he was getting a hard time from his friends. Well, if you only make noise when it affects you and your friends, that's not public policy. That's just self-interest. So that's
Tweet it. That's great.
So that's not an ethical position, but I'm just making the larger point that we haven't seen a lot of times when Trump seems cowed by any of that, and so his willingness to troll cynically has no boundary.
Yeah.
And in The Art of the Deal, he tells the story, and this totally applies now. And I read The Art of the Deal, during the campaign, and thought, okay, I don't know how much more I'll have to study this guy, but this is interesting as I do my homework. Where he talks about how one of his great breakthroughs in his first few buildings was he said he realized if you told a big lie and said this building was going to be the tallest building in the world, they would fact check it and say the Trump Tower is not only the tallest building in the world, it's only half the size of Sears Tower. And he said that was a huge win, because now Trump Tower and Sears Tower are in the same sentence. And people figure, well, everyone puffs, but now he's in that category. And that's a version of what he does in a lot of these things. So to try to answer your question specifically, or at least the way we do it, I'm curious how you feel about it, because you're on so much with us. You're in the same journalistic project often many nights, which is we try to figure out, is there anything here that is real? And should that be extricated from it to be reported? Or is it just political controversy, which might be referenced for context, but it's certainly never going to be the lead story or the headline banner you see on the bottom of the screen, because that's not real, and that's the game he's trying to trick you into covering.
I think this is a complicated one because he has such a big bully pulpit right now that and I think the distinction is not just covering everything he says because he says it, but rather trying to identify for the public where there are issues and where there are efforts to create fear and drive division. And in terms of the caravan, if no one covered the caravan, the result would be that his message that we're about to be overrun by all these criminals and terrorists might actually stand, right? And I'm not saying it's how it's covered, I think, is the important part, because that is hard to ignore if the President of the United States is saying this is about to happen and we're going to amass troops at the border to protect you. And that's why I think the bigger problem here, because a lot of people have sort of appreciated, I'm not sure what's going on, and I wouldn't know that it was moving really slowly, and it was actually still 1,000 miles away, and actually that there's an organized effort by the Mexican government to talk about offering a place to stay for some of those folks. And there's several things that are going on that actually are important for folks to understand. And I think it is critically important for folks to understand where and how the messaging is happening in order to manipulate the election. Now, so I think the problem is, it's really, most of the folks watching MSNBC are watching because they know something's wrong and they want to get the facts. Then there are the folks watching Fox News. Yeah. And the bigger issue that we have as a societal issue is that we have at least two vastly different sets of understanding about what reality even is right now in the country. That's driven by the fact that we have so many people not getting facts. And then if you add to that local news, right, the disappearance of local news, oftentimes, which could be a counterbalancing and tell a story from a standpoint that's relevant for a local community. We're in New York, so we don't have this problem. We have much more local news coverage than most places. So what replaces the local news is religious radio, which is essentially Fox News on the radio. So we actually have people who aren't getting facts at all, anywhere, from anybody. So that, I think, is the bigger problem, is how do we penetrate to have a conversation with one another about what is actually happening. And I'll give you one last anecdote, because my daughter spent some time in Arizona. She may never speak to me again. And here's this little brown kid from Brooklyn kind of going, wait, you think what? And she was having a conversation with a van driver, a bus driver, about the tax bill. And he started saying some stuff that was totally like Planet Mars about the tax bill. It was crazy. And she was 16 at the time going, that's just not true, and that's not a thing. But this is my point. She's 16 talking to a 45-year-old man, and what he was saying made no factual sense to her because she had a few. That's a deep societal problem, and the news alone can't solve that. That actually becomes how we have conversations with one. It was much more important that she be able to say, as a person with a relationship, not a relationship to him as but you know what I mean, an interpersonal interaction, to say, but wait, is that true? I don't think so, because I actually heard it was X, Y, and Z. And him going, you heard that? And she was like, yeah, that's what I heard. That kind of human connection we don't have, and none of our news outlets can mimic that necessarily, unless we're actually trying to have the kind of dialogue we're having right here and right now. So, I mean, that's my fear for the country, right, is the way in which we have a segregated reality of a portrayal of the world. And Trump just gets to take that reality and paint it even more aggressively and more broadly.
Well, and so I mean, I think that raises 2 points. One, which is a type of skepticism or information literacy that you'd want people to get from the schools, and the fact that there's a political movement trying to undermine that is really problematic. But you want to be skeptical of everything you read, whether it's in the New York Times or on MSNBC or on Fox. You want to bring that so that you come out with all the sources. I mean, that's what standard liberal arts education would countenance. It's why in the aptly titled Jay-Z song, Ignorant Shit, he says they're all weirdos, De Niro's in practice, looking at themselves in the mirror backwards, only believe half of what your earlobe captures. And you don't want to believe everything you hear, even from people that you are liking or feeling affinity towards. The second layer to that, I think.
Are we clapping? Let's clap.
No,
that was great.
So Maya Wiley gets half the room clapping for the deep point, and I got one person who's like, I know that song, and that's fine. I can live with that. The second point, though, that I think is an inexorable antidote to what you're saying, even if you take the pessimistic theory of the case that that's a big problem, which is there are still reality-based bubble events that will fact check even that level of complete fiction. The problem is it doesn't apply to everything. So people who are being told lies about a caravan 3,000 miles away, that bubble may never pop. They may live and die having a belief about that was put in their heads. But if they're being told something about Katrina, which was famously covered one way on Fox News, I mean, they initially tried to say it was going well. And it blew up in their face on Fox News and everywhere else. And even conservatives and even Fox viewers, when you check the polling on this, saw that, well, no, it happened here in America. People knew people talked, and the other information crowded that out. And the view of Katrina, widely understood, was the government. It was this tragedy the government mishandled. The Iraq War was you could call it a bubble event, complex, because when did it get as bad as it got? But eventually, the political partisanship around it faded and gave way to the reality that people kept coming back from there. And people knew people from over there. And it didn't matter that Sean Hannity was lying about it and saying it's going really well, or the only reason it's not going well is because somebody else's fault. No, eventually you got to the point that the facts of the Iraq War were the perception, the bubble popped, which is why you had every candidate running. By the end, you had Donald Trump running against it.
Right.
The housing market's like that, right? So there are a bunch of situations where the bubble pops. The problem, I think, for a democratic society is we can't wait on only those being the issues where we get facts over time, late, and then everything else lives, as you put it, in polarized lies.
And the race angle to that, because the reality was, I mean, with Hurricane Katrina, you had a lot of white people getting in cars and driving 2 states over saying, oh no, that was a disaster. It's not because black folks showed up in Houston and white people started saying, oh, I mean, they did eventually, but there was a lag because people had to start to see, and that it was on, that there was news feed. I mean, that there was video. That there were images, that you could see black people on roofs, that you could see the images of black people in the Superdome was a big reason why people started to recognize something really messed up just happened to black people. If there had not been footage, we would not be having the conversation this way. And the problem for folks in the caravan is that all the footage is a big old horde of brown people, which actually plays to the both implicit and sometimes explicit bias that says zero-sum game. My people are going to lose if these people win, and I don't know who these people are. So I think I think you're absolutely right, and what I think has to confound us in the context of a rapidly changing country, because part of the driving of fear, and there's research on this on the immigration front, for example, part of the driving of the fear of immigration is about jobs, is about resources, is about, wait, I have been working hard for 30 years, I'm now earning, my take home is essentially less pay, I'm less able to hold on to my house if I'm lucky enough to still have it or pay my rent. I am actually seeing a harder time getting my kids to college, and when they graduate, they're less likely to have a job than when I came out of college. I mean, so that's the reality that people are seeing. And one of the reasons why Trump, just to bring it back to the sociopath, is that what he tapped that was different from other Republicans, Mitt Romney didn't do this, McCain didn't do this, George Bush didn't do this, neither one of the Bushes did this, is he said, I'm gonna be a racist that's an economic populist. Because it used to be, you'd say, oh, I can't be a racist, and I'm not gonna be an economic populist. And he just flipped the script. And so he can fearmonger and continue to fearmonger that with a racial lens. And so it's both if it's in folks here in the U.S., if there's not video footage that is incontrovertible that people are being treated in a discriminatory fashion, it's not going to penetrate. And if it's about immigrants and immigrants of color, then it's going to be the horde that is coming to take what little I have left. And so yes, and we have to actually confront how we think about and talk about race in a much more complex and honest way. And that's, some of that has to happen, and and I give MSNBC and Ari in particular a lot of credit, because you've also done many, many more voices of people of color actually in the news and speaking as experts in the news. That's actually a sea change, and it's not that recent. I mean, it's fairly recent. It's not that old. But we have to find other spaces like that where there's the ability to say, oh, right. Here are people who are counter to stereotype. We actually can break this down, but we have to have more images of people and more interaction that are counter to stereotype.
Right. So using visuals in a positive way.
In a positive way. And that's my point about having more, and it's true for women too, right? And all the women who are now legal analysts on MSNBC.
Yes. Yeah.
And no one's saying, oh, we got women legal analysts. It's like, we got legal analysts.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and they happen to all be, I mean, right? So those things matter tremendously, and we have to find that and find ways to do that in more parts of the culture while we're recognizing that the incredible insecurity that people are feeling is being generated into a direction of hate.
Right. Right. And it's legal analysts who are black women. You have a lot of black women on your show, and that has changed, to your point, really the markup of what you look like, what you look at when you turn on your TV. And one of the things that you talk so much about, the both of you, and is all of this voter suppression going on, which I don't know how. I mean, it just feels like every day this should be the on the front page of every newspaper. Obviously, we've heard about a lot of things happening all over the country. In Georgia particularly is, I think, one of the most egregious examples of it.
Florida.
And in Florida,
North Carolina.
Absolutely. And we've been talking a lot about the national level, but there's these local, ballot initiatives particularly, who might actually allow us to do some real criminal justice reform. So Florida's an example where there's something on the ballot that would allow, I think, 1 million people can't vote in Florida, who are 1.6 million people.
And remember, just a quick stat on that, just to show how significant this is, 1.6 million people can't vote because they're formerly incarcerated with a felony record. And by the way, that's 1 out of every 13 black people in the state. Hillary Clinton lost Florida, 1.2% margin. That was roughly a little over 100,000 votes. But 1.6 million couldn't vote. Think about that.
I think it runs really deep when we think about the stories we tell ourselves as Americans, which again are pretty much transcend partisanship. We're living in such a time where people are constantly telling you what's wrong with the other side or what's wrong with Trump. Now we got your questions coming in, which is great. And so much of these problems are deeper than that. So, for example, we tell ourselves a story, and our kids go to school, and they're told that we're this old democracy, right? And if democracy means everyone has a reasonable right to vote, we've been in democracy since the late 60s, sort of, right? So it is true and not negligible that as a matter of history and political science, it was considered radical progressive. It was left of Bernie in the 1700s to let anyone who didn't own property vote. That is a thing then, and we can't be sort of temporally parochial about that. That was a big deal then, but that does not mean that we're an old democracy if the words have any meaning. We're a very young democracy because for a long time we had a sexist and racist model. And even as it was reformed, and more amendments to the Constitution deal with expanding or protecting suffrage than any other issue because it has been such a difficult, long-running change to our compact. But it's very new. And when you look at someone who directly invokes and gives comfort to white supremacy being in the White House, building on a political movement that was doing it in Jim Crow one way and is doing it with voter ID and other mechanisms nowadays. And I always say that not all Republicans, not all Republican officials, but many many, then you see that, gosh, we're a young democracy that fixed some of this stuff in the 60s a bit and then was backsliding very quickly. And now we're in a place where, look, I think reasonable people can differ on the felon enfranchisement issues. I think most people, if they've served their debt to society, should have full rights. You could come up with examples where if the thing they did was bad enough, you can understand the debate over that. But that's one piece of it. The larger piece is we have an effort to basically keep black and brown people from voting for racist and political reasons. And the political part's funny because you say, yeah, in the old days it was purely racist. Now it's actually just, well, they're in the other party. It's a different type of illegality, or it's in many places both. And that comes at a time when, again, the legal architecture is a conservative Supreme Court overruled part of the Voting Rights Act. And a conservative Supreme Court upheld these voter ID laws, which are very clearly are designed to discriminate because we had elections for hundreds of years, no matter who was allowed in, without driver's licenses. In fact, if you remember, there weren't any fucking cars. So, not sure that you need a driver's license to vote.
That's a good point.
Don't need to go to law school for that. And that's something that we cover voter suppression quite a bit as part of it, but it is also one of those things that's, you just said, it's constantly undergirds all these places. When you talk about how close the race is or who's going to turn out, you've already effectively had a lot of people disappeared from the electorate, and that is a profound problem for us. Right. And I say that without regard to party or partisanship.
Right.
There's one piece of good news, besides the fact that there are about like 6 states looking at ballot initiatives on criminal justice, including Florida, and another dozen on voter and making it easier for voters to vote. So that's good. But there was also a big victory, because I don't want us to leave it like there's only bad news. It's just mostly bad. That Pennsylvania, as a result of civil rights advocates bringing litigation that against the voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression in Pennsylvania, actually state level, not federal, state suit, but took it all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, voted in favor of striking down the restrictive laws, and then they sent it back, and they actually carved out a non-partisan strategy on gerrymandering. They actually made it nonpartisan. Like this is like that right now. That's revolutionary in this country to say we're going to have districts that are drawn around nonpartisan lines, as opposed to districts that we draw around ensuring that we're protecting a block of one party or the other. And so I say that because it's an important state, obviously in national elections, as well as obviously for the folks who live in the state of Pennsylvania, but also to suggest our state and local strategies right now, now that we're in the dark, winter is here. It's not coming, winter is here. But it's not because they're not things that we can't really deeply impact. And in this election cycle, it'll be the ballot initiatives at state level, but it's also going to be how states and local governments start to innovate and demonstrate that we can and should do these things in democratic ways that support more participation, not less, and that start to get us to see ourselves as communities, not as Democrats or Republicans or Latinos and whites, or all of the different ways in which we've been othered and separated from one another. Yeah. So that does give me hope, and I think it also is a path forward for us no matter what happens on Tuesday.
I have like a million other questions, but you guys wrote these out in the dark, so I want to read them out. And they're great. So, okay, who is going to run for president in 2020?
Ari.
I'm supposed to run?
Sorry, that was a secret.
And then you're his running mate.
I
think a lot of people would.
That's all.
I'm going to run for president of Def Jam Records.
Oh, good
It's all a stepping stone.
You'll get there. Okay, if the Dems take back the House, do you think articles of impeachment will be brought, and what are the chances of them moving forward?
I think the Dems will try really hard to have articles of impeachment if they take the House. The problem will be the Senate.
I think the Democrats have to wait and see what Bob Mueller comes up with.
Yeah.
And if he ultimately closes down his investigation without putting forward the case that there was a high crime of collusion and everything relates to what other people did.
So you're not worried about obstruction?
I'm just telling you, obstruction without the underlying crime is a huge deal in any normal courtroom. I do think it's more complicated with the chief executive officer. Nixon, you had obstruction, and he was in on an underlying political crime of espionage, of Watergate burglary, of bugging the offices, of everything that we know. If you have, look, by textbook definition, the President of the United States has committed obstruction of justice already. But if he did that only because he's nuts and not because there was evidence of a crime that he was covering up and obstructing, the fact that he has constitutional powers to run the law enforcement function of the country complicates that. So that's a long-winded, lawyerly way of saying they have to see what Mueller does, and if Mueller doesn't have collusion, yes, the House has a co-equal and independent obligation to go see what it finds. But if Mueller doesn't find it with how long he's been running it with his power, and they don't find it, I'm not sure that they will see the legal case to move forward on obstruction alone.
But is it probable that they won't find a crime? I mean,
I think
nothing?
but this is my point about there have been crimes, and that's why there are over 30 indictments.
Yeah.
The question isn't whether crimes. The question is whether crimes link to Donald Trump.
Right.
And that is and none of us can really, I mean, we can all speculate about whether or not it sounds like Mueller might be getting close to that, but there is so much information they have that we don't, that it's really very hard to say one way or the other whether or not that connection is going to be made. It's very hard for me to imagine there won't be, as we're seeing with Roger Stone right now, right, and WikiLeaks, that there may not be, there's already indication that the campaign was trying to get dirt from foreign nationals. That's also a campaign crime, right? It's a campaign finance crime. And I think it goes back to the same political problem as obstruction maybe, but I think the point is we don't know, and we shouldn't pretend we know, and we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket, which is, I think, really kind of what you're saying, Ari. Although I wanted to do what Ari gets to do to us on TV and say, "Let me push you on that, Ari." But I didn't get to do that. But I think the fact that Donald Trump could get a pass on obstruction of justice on a question of whether his campaign conspired with foreign nationals is completely outrageous, given that we have impeached for less.
Yeah.
Can we do another show of hands? Are you guys game? All right, I'll give you 3 choices. 1, there wasn't any conspiring by the Trump campaign with the Russians. 2, there was Trump campaign conspiracy with the Russians, but Donald Trump didn't personally get involved in it. And 3, there was conspiracy and he was involved in it. Wait, so number 1,
Everyone's like,
you are ready. All right, show of hands. Number 1, no conspiracy with Russia. 1.
Okay.
If anyone's listening on the live stream, that's 1 hand in the air. 2.
Yeah.
2.
Door number 2, Trump campaign level conspiracy, Donald Trump not involved. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow. Door number 3.
No.
Y'all are New Yorkers.
Interesting.
Okay.
Can we not, though, forget Southern District of New York, since we're New Yorkers? Hello.
Yes. Well, we got all the lights now.
Trump org is under investigation, and that is Donald Trump. That's all I'm saying.
Right. Keep that in mind when you get sad. Okay. Is the Republican Party shrinking? And that's a question I actually I kind of wanted to get with you, Ari. You know how obsessed I am with like men, white men. leaving the Republican Party. I'm obsessed with the idea that white men will wake up one morning and be like, this party doesn't.
What about white women?
Well, of course, absolutely. And we can talk about that too. Okay. And I think that needs to happen. I think both need to happen, but we talk a lot about white women, and we talk a lot about white men generally. But no, we don't talk a lot about.
Well, white men just talk a lot.
Yes, exactly.
Like that.
So it's you do it for us. But we won't. I think that the Kavanaugh hearings demonstrated the worst kind of male behavior, white male behavior, I've ever seen in my life. Right? So why don't men look at that in the way that I looked at Sarah Palin and I was like, no, don't do that. That makes us look bad. Why don't men think that awful white Republican men make them look bad?
I gotta go. Look, number one, Brett Kavanaugh cut his teeth in the conservative legal Republican space by working for Ken Starr, interrogating Bill Clinton about his sex life in a manner, and I'm not saying everything is the same, but I'm just noting, in a manner that was far more invasive for a far longer period of time than his one hearing during his relatively quick promotion to a lifetime appointment, when he threw several tantrums about the questions that he was faced with. So that was a kind of a smoldering, obvious, rageful demonstration of that kind of privileged white male, in his case conservative, but we know it knows no political boundaries, that kind of privilege. And I think that the country got to see that in a situation where people were really stoked to think that there might be a process whereby he would lose votes. And he did. He lost one Republican senator's vote, and she happens to be a woman. Query whether that was relevant. Only she can speak to that. But we just were talking about who's in the darn building, who's in the Congress. So he did lose votes, but they had enough of a vote margin for it not to matter. And now the country's taking that in. So I think that's a huge problem. The second part of your question is basically, are men going to change? I mean, we're here on the uptown, Upper East Side, right?
Yeah.
You know the old question, how many therapy patients does it take to change a light bulb?
Does it?
Anyone know this one? Because therapy is very useful. Does anyone know this one?
No.
Nobody? One, as long as they want to change. Where are my any Jewish mothers in the house? Yeah, I know who likes that kind of joke. Only a few of you. So the point is, he's so charming. If you're 70, do these people, these men that you're profiling, do they want to change? Is that going to happen? I haven't seen it thus far, but anything can happen, and there are experiences people go through in life, public or personal, that can change them, but I see the light bulb joke for my answer.
I've been black all my life, so don't answer.
Yeah, it's not your fault. Yeah, you don't have to answer.
But do you see color?
Yeah.
Pinky beige.
All right, what else do we have?
Okay,
I don't want to
we gotta wrap up.
keep people up too late. What else do we
This
have?
one's very long. Okay, Google has 90% of the search market. YouTube, parentheses Google, nearly all of the online video market, plus they dominate the ad distribution world. We talk about breaking up big banks. What about big tech?
Yeah. No, it's a huge issue, and one of the things we talk less about is that actually tech is driving facts and information much more so right now than news, in the sense that people are using the platforms to drive information, sometimes manipulate it, drive lies, right? So we saw that in the election cycle. And I don't think there's any question that they're kind of becoming, they're like the sort of the new Ma Bells, right? But in a very different and complex way. The question about how to break them up, I think, is not, it's not clear to me that whether the issue is to think about them in that traditional way and break them up, or to think about the way in which you think about, because first of all, we're talking about a country where we're still far too many of us can't even get online at home. And we're still talking about a country in which most of us don't have the ability to get the facts that we want or need, right? So the way in which they become spaces that both create and access to and drive what facts and information is, I think, a much, much more complicated question than just whether they're broken up. Because you could say the same thing for the large telecommunications firms, which, of course, a lot of vertical integration issues. I guess the point is, some of these questions are so complicated that our mistake would be to jump to an answer in reaction to having seen some problems, rather than figure out what is it that we need and how do we create more opportunities for a lot more small and local ways to have both social networks as well as information networks. And then what does that look like? And then we can look at, is the problem the big guys, or the problem that we don't have enough significant alternative choices so that we're not choosing one or the other? Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I mean, it was Jay-Z who said, hashtags and retweets, 140 characters in these streets. It's not really that relevant. The point is that, I practice First Amendment law.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff. And as many of you know, First Amendment protections mostly, I'm simplifying, but mostly get you between what the government censors and interferes with and the rest of our First Amendment rights. So a lot of the things that the government's not allowed to do, like the term of art in the law is discriminate based on content, these platforms are very much allowed to do. And I think that cuts both ways. I'll say something that may be somewhat unpopular, but given my grounding in First Amendment work, I totally oppose efforts to boycott, deplatform, disappear people because you simply disagree with their political views, their First Amendment speech rights. I'm not interested in, and I don't think it's good for civic America or democracy, trying to boycott Sean Hannity off of TV or off an internet platform or you name it. Having said that, the flip side is we are waiting on these companies that the writer here of this question, as I think expertly articulated, are amassing a great deal of power, even if it's not technically monopolistic under anti-trade precedent. And that's a panel we're doing later tonight for those of you who want to get into it. We have now ended up in a situation where they are huge pipelines for our democratic dialogue, and they're making these decisions, and we're all stuck with their default model. And so we haven't had the hard public conversations in a manner that we can hold them accountable for. My position, to be clear, would be defend Sean Hannity's right to speak, and he should be on the platform, and there has to be some reasonable accommodation for whether this is if it's only going to be a blue platform, fine, but people should know that. If it's going to say it's a news or opinion platform, wider opinion should be shared. But if someone's given out bomb instructions on pipes or defaming, and all they do is defame through fake news, which is essentially
Well, you just said Sean Hannity.
actionable. I would argue that a lot of what's in that show is not legal defamation, although it's objectionable in other ways. But to pick a different example,
Alex Jones? Yeah, okay.
right? The bulk of what he's doing
Right.
is defamatory and conspiracy, and a lot of it gets into inciting violence, and I think you have to draw that line. But you have to know that line. And these companies, and we did a 10-part series on Facebook last year, these companies are interested in maximum clicks with minimum controversy.
Right, right. And you're covering them very well. I think that's part of it too, to hold them accountable, and then they're going to have to do it. Okay, last question. This is might be really controversial. Trying to answer it really quickly. Ari, what is your go-to sandwich at Zingerman's?
Zingerman's in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
No shirt or fresher? Fresser? I'm saying
What's
it wrong.
that?
There we go.
Not sure.
Go Blue. That's
Yeah,
Michigan's my alma
it's
mater. I love the corn, just classic corned beef, just like at Katz when you get a real high pile of corned beef, where you basically are eating your way through two sandwiches, and you're best off eating alone or not with any photography.
Is that
Do
what
you have a favorite sandwich?
I can't eat bread. I'm gluten intolerant.
Oh. Can you eat pizza? Gluten-free pizza? What are you going to
had
do?
gluten-free pizza?
Okay.
So the
I will
answer
say this,
is
Maya.
no.
I've gotten to know you and worked with you for a while. That's the only intolerance I'm aware of you exhibiting.
Whoa. Let's end on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
You're great.